he wasn't an anti-Semite. This is a Christian who says, Jesus was a Jew, so I want to practice some form of Judaism that Jesus would have been familiar with. And he had this post on the internet where he's talking about the Talmud, and he's saying, but the Talmud is so horrible it should be burned. And I contacted him. I said, you don't know what you're saying. People burn the Talmud, and then they often burn the Jews along with the Talmud, or force them to convert. Shalom and welcome to Hebrew Voices. I'm here today with Mordechai Weintraub. He's a doctoral candidate at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He holds a bachelor's degree in Talmud and Biblical Studies, also from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and a master's in Talmud Halakha, technically the department is called. He also, before entering into the academic sphere, studied for many years in ultra-Orthodox yeshivas, where he acquired a vast knowledge of traditional Jewish literature. Shalom, Mordechai, and welcome to the program.
Hi. Hi, Nehemia. So
Mordechai, and I forgot to mention, you're also a researcher at the Institute for Hebrew Bible Manuscript Research, of which I'm the executive director. So that's also quite important.
I am proud to be a member of this institute. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming on the program. One of your really great discoveries that I want to talk about, I want to get to, but we want to talk about other things first, is there's a Torah scroll known as the Ashkar-Scroll or the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll. I saw it when it was on display at the Israel Museum many years ago in the Shrine of the Book. And there were 2 known fragments, and you discovered 13 more fragments. And maybe you have more now and if it's not published, you don't have to say it. But you published 13 more fragments, which is significant because, why don't you tell us what's important about the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll? Right, there's, if you go to any synagogue, there's a Torah scroll. What's special about the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll from a historical perspective?
Yeah, so it's, of course, the historical perspective is the issue, because it's one of the most ancient Torah scrolls, known after the Dead Sea Scrolls, or Judean Desert Scrolls is more accurate. So this is the first one. It's ancient, and we all are interested more in ancient items than of modern. And this is not just one of ancient items, scrolls, but it's in a period that we don't have mostly any Hebrew scrolls from this era.
Let's back up. When you say it's a scroll of what, right? Because we have Dead Sea Scrolls that are like the War of the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. And what is the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll? What does it contain?
So the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll is, now we know that it's a Torah scroll. So all the Pentateuch in one scroll. So in the beginning, the first discovery of the 2 parts that you mentioned was just from Exodus. And the assumption was that this can be a scroll just of Exodus.
In other words, you're saying when the first 2 pieces were known, it could have been it was just a standalone scroll of Exodus and not of the whole Torah. And so you're just, so I didn't realize that. Okay, so your discovery, keep going, this is important.
So my discovery is of some fragments from other books.
So that proved it was the whole Torah, not just Exodus.
Yeah. So the fragments I recognize, I discover are just from 4 books of the Torah, of the Pentateuch. Mm-hmm. And so Leviticus, I didn't find any fragment from Leviticus.
You didn't? Okay. Well, but
probably it was right. A complete
so if you had said you found fragments of Genesis through Numbers, somebody could say, well, Deuteronomy wasn't included. But it's pretty unlikely that if it was Genesis and through Deuteronomy that Leviticus was excluded. So that's really interesting. So this actually brings up a different question that maybe you're actually the expert to talk about, I think. Is it unusual to have a scroll in the ancient world as big as the Torah? Or is that normal? Do we even know?
Okay, so we don't have a lot of evidence.
Okay.
The first mention of literature mention of a scroll with all the Pentateuch is in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud and
Mhm.
Jerusalem Talmud, but not in the Tanaic period. So in the Tanaic literature, there is probably tested just the existence of scrolls of one book.
Wait, so they mentioned that there were scrolls of one. So actually, can you explain? You are the expert again to explain what is the Tannaitic period versus the Amoraic period? Because
So the
some of
Tanaic
my audience
period,
have never heard of a Tana or an Amora.
yeah,
So
okay. So the Tanaic period, so all the Tanaic period and the Amoraic period are periods internal in the Jewish history. So it's not
okay.
connected to other to history of other
No,
people.
but that's normal. In other words, if you're talking about Christianity, you can talk about the period of the apostles and the period of the church
Yeah,
fathers.
yeah, yeah.
And
Of
someone
course.
who
So
isn't familiar will
that
say, church fathers, they're not the father of my church. No, that's a period of history, guys.
yeah, computer research.
It
So
doesn't
so
matter what you think. It's
yeah.
historians use that. Yeah.
So the Tanaic period is probably from after the 70, so after the
Destruction of the temple.
after the destruction of the second temple,
Hmm.
and until the
And guys, Mordechai's native language is Hebrew. He's
yeah.
also fluent in Yiddish, I understand. So I really appreciate you stepping out of your comfort zone and explaining these things in English. And
Thank
we
you
could
for
have the
the
conversation in Hebrew, but nobody else would. Most of the audience wouldn't understand it. So, all right, go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. So my English
It's actually wonderful. I hear this all the time
yeah.
from non-native English speakers. You speak English much better than many people who live in Dallas, where I live. So, oh, they don't even speak English, many people. So, all right. So it's from the around the year 70, the destruction of the temple, until
Until the beginning of the third century,
okay, so like around the year
when
200, 210 or something,
220,
220 even. Okay,
220, yeah, 220
hmm, the cutoff
the
or
date.
so. Okay,
Yeah,
but it
it's
wasn't that somebody woke up
219.
today and said the Tanaitic period has ended, and now we're in the period of the Amoraim, right? In other words, it wasn't. I mean, it's similar, kind of like to the Byzantine Empire. No one in the Byzantine Empire knew they were in the Byzantine Empire. They thought they were in the Roman Empire, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But at a
yeah.
certain point, they realized, okay, we're not really. Well, that might be different. Okay, because there was a period where people looked back and said, "You're not a Tana, you're an Amora, so you can't disagree with him unless you have a Tana source." Isn't there something like that?
Yeah, 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 yeah. There are some sources like that, and the first generation of the Amoraim. So
Hmm.
after 220,
Yeah.
there are some sages, some rabbis that are considered like Tanaim. Like
Okay.
so, there was a little blur.
So we've got from around 70 to 220 as the period. Guys, this is really important part of history. If you want to understand Jewish history, you'll see these terms thrown about, and if you don't know what they are, it can be very confusing. So that's the period of the Tana, the Tanaim or Tanaitic,
yeah,
Tanaic.
and they create a very massive literature corpus of
And the most important piece of literature of the Tanaim is
the Mishnah, of
the
course.
Mishnah, right? But it's not only the Mishnah, it's other things as well, but that's the most famous, most important. And then the the Amoraim starting around the year 220 and go until when?
Oh, this is a very tricky question. So it's probably it differs from the in Eretz Israel
In the land
and
of Israel,
Babylonia,
yeah.
the land of Israel and Babylonia. So
Okay.
in the land of Israel, in Babylonia, the consensus in the around is the sixth century. So it's around
Okay.
500 or maybe a little bit later.
So the story that I was told in elementary school that the last Amoraim were Ravina and Ravashi in the year 500. Is that? I mean, is there any validity to that from an academic historical perspective?
Yeah, 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 of course.
Okay.
So the death of Ravina, one of the
Because there was two. I
scrolls
wasn't told
there.
that.
is called the editor of the Babylonian Talmud is
Ah,
500, but
okay.
probably the edition was some years later, so
Okay.
maybe 550 or we don't know exactly.
But give or take 500, 550, something like this.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
In the Land of Israel Talmud, so the Talmud Yerushalmi,
Oh,
um,
wait a minute. So in English, that's usually called, and this is weird to me, it's called the Jerusalem Talmud, even though it wasn't written in Jerusalem. In Hebrew, it's called the Jerusalem Talmud. And that, because I guess Jerusalem there means the land of Israel. I guess, I don't know. And then in English, sometimes they'll call it the Palestinian Talmud. I don't quite understand why, but I think that goes back to an earlier period of history, meaning modern history. So the Jerusalem
no,
Talmud,
it's
when
not. I think Palestinian Talmud is not because of the modern history. The Palestinian Talmud because it was there was called the Syria Palestina. So the
okay,
Palestinian, yeah,
okay, so you're saying so the Jerusalem Talmud from a Jewish perspective is called Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, but from the non-Jewish perspective, that province was after the year 135, I guess. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, was renamed Syria Palestina. Okay, so but it's not
of
okay,
course
makes sense.
The Palestinian Talmud is of course a modern term, but
No,
I
right,
think
right.
because of the
What do they call it in Jewish literature from I don't know 500 years ago? They didn't call it the Palestinian or the Jerusalem Talmud, did they?
they use both terms.
No,
So
but they don't say Palestinian, right?
no Palestinian, of course not.
Okay,
Of
what
course
do they
not.
say when
Just
they're writing in Hebrew and Aramaic when they talk about the Jerusalem Talmud?
so it's Talmud Eretz Israel, so the
Oh,
land
oh,
of
the land
Israel
of
Talmud,
Israel. Oh, okay,
and Talmud Yerushalmi also.
okay. Don't they also say
So
like something like B'nai Ma'arava or something?
yeah, it's also this is a mostly a Aramaic term, Talmud
Okay,
de Bnei Ma'arava, so
which
the
is very
Talmud
interesting. What does it mean, B'nai
of the
Ma'arava?
West, so of the
So
West, because it's the opposite. It's of
it's opposite of the East.
opposite
Of
West.
Babylonia. So guys, this is a really interesting thing. We today in America at least, and it comes from England. You talk about the English called it the Near East, the land of Israel, and Americans call it the Middle East, or the and middle, by the way, here means near, like Midwest in English. I come from the Midwest, is the near West. Like a
Mhm.
midwife is the person who stands next to the wife. Um, the Middle East, but in Hebrew sources, Israel is, or at least in some Hebrew sources, Hebrew is called the West and Babylonia the East. It's very interesting. That's an interesting perspective to. Okay, so we have the Tanaim and the Amoraim. They're writing the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud. When does it end, and when does the period of the Amoraim end in Israel?
So the Palestinian Talmud is probably the fourth century or the beginning
Hmm.
of the fifth century. So it's
Okay.
about 100 year, 1 century before the Babylonian Talmud,
So
and it's
what happened
because of
that? Yeah. Go ahead.
historical events. So there was some
Hmm.
um, persecutions
Hmm.
about the Jewish community, and because of their literature was also
Suppressed or
pressed, decreased.
suppressed? Okay. Okay, so you have the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, and they have a lot of overlaps, don't they?
Yeah, so basically they have a lot of common traditions about.
Okay.
So the Talmud, that's saying what's the difference between the Tanaic period and the Amoraic period. So the
Yeah.
Tanaic period is the main work, the Mishnah. The
Hmm.
main work is the Mishnah, but in the Talmudic, the Amoraic period, the Talmudim, the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli, so the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud,
Hmm.
and they are interpreting the Mishnah mostly.
Okay.
So there are a lot of other
Hmm.
literature in the so the work are very a lot of associations. So it's not a commentary like a modern commentary with a with a
So they use
structure.
what we call the principle of association. So they start off talk. I'll just explain for the audience. So they'll be talking. Their jumping off point is, well, the Tanaim wrote in the, or said in the Mishnah these different things, and they start discussing it, and then they'll say, well, they mentioned trees, and we have this other tradition about trees, and they'll say, Rabbi Akiva also said this third thing, or Rabbi Yossi said this other thing about trees, or he said this other thing not related to trees, and now they start talking about the traditions of Rabbi Yossi. I don't know if that's it's not an actual example, but it's
Yeah,
a
but
lot of
but
the
but
principle of association. It's interesting
yeah,
that we have the principle of association in the Tanakh. People don't realize that. There's one of my favorite examples, because I love dogs, is it talks about not bringing the price of a dog to the temple, and right next to that, I don't remember if it's before or after in Deuteronomy, is the commandment about interest, and the word for interest is neshech, and which could actually be translated something like biting interest, perhaps. But then nashach is a dog biting, although not in biblical Hebrew. But apparently it existed at the time because there's still that connections. So we have these principles of association in the Tanakh as well. But it
yeah.
but it
I think
goes
I
on
think all the
steroids in the Talmud.
so I think all the ancient world literature was like this. So the
Oh, really?
association, yeah,
Hmm.
it's our the literature we know now is outcome of the Greek work,
Hmm.
Aristoteles
Aristotle.
and
Yeah. So
Aristotle.
that's interesting. So in other words, we think of today of things being organized systematically, although even the term systematically is a loaded term, right? In other words, we want it to be done chronologically. We want it to be done by subject, which are actually two different ways of doing it. But if I think about like the Mishneh Torah of Maimonides, right? So he has a section on, I don't know, uh, finance, right? He like has a legal section about damages, right? And everything in there is about damages. And you open up the Talmudic tractate on damages, or one of them, is multiple, and you see they're talking about like demons and stuff, and you're like, what does this have to do with damages? Well, because it's a principle of association.
Yeah.
Um, so you made the state, and we got sidetracked, but it's a really important piece of information for people to have, the difference between Tanaim and Amoraim. You said something that surprised me a bit. You said the Tanaitic period, or the Tanaim, began with the destruction of the temple. So we have names of people before the destruction of the temple in the Mishnah, in the
Yeah.
early rabbinical literature. What are they called if they're not called Tanaim? Did the Amoraim call them Tanaim? Did Shammai and Hillel, who lived around 30 BCE, are they not Tanaim in your by that definition?
So we can call them Tanaim,
Okay.
but we it's common to differentiate between
Mhm.
the rabbis, the sages before
Mhm.
the destruction of the temple, and they call the Zugot. So until
Okay, the
Shammai and
pairs.
Hillel, the pairs, yeah,
Okay, what
and
are the
it's not
Zugot? So
not
the Zugot is an
exactly
earlier period of history, you're saying, than the Tanaim proper.
Tanaim,
Okay,
yes, yeah.
okay. And what is
Um,
the Zugot? What is the significance of that for the
the
audience?
goat the goat are pairs of sages that are one of them was the head of the court of Bedin,
Hmm.
and
Okay.
one was the president of the
Hmm.
Jews of the minority. So there was and there are a list of all the pairs. I don't remember how long the list is,
But
how
this is
many.
in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers. It's usually translated in
Yeah,
English.
they are mentioned in Pirkei Avot
So
and in
so you say one. So do you remember if Shammai? So one was the head of what, the Sanhedrin? You're saying, or you say he
yeah,
was the
yeah.
head of the court, the Sanhedrin. The other one was
Sanhedrin was the Jewish court, so yeah,
right. Okay, a nice Greek word, Sunedrion. Um,
yeah.
and so the other one was what was the other role? The other one, he was the president of
A president. So one was Av
ah.
Bedin,
So
was
the
the
so you mean the title in Hebrew, Nasi?
Nasi, yeah.
Okay, so guys, that's like an official title, or I don't know if it was then, but it later was understood as an official title. It's not clear to me exactly what Nasi is. Maybe we could say that for a different discussion. Meaning, like, what was his actual job as Nasi? That's an interesting question. But there's an implication he's a descendant of King David, isn't there? If he's Nasi, or not necessarily.
I don't remember.
Okay, so like the most famous Nasi that people would have heard of is Hillel II, who, according to somewhat later traditions, established the rabbinical calendar as it would later, or some form of the calendar at least, right? He's in the year 359. So you're saying Nasi is not the head of the Beit of the Sanhedrin, but it's some
The
other
head of the community. So the
of
head
the
of the
community. Okay,
the Jewish
because
community.
that's interesting because okay, so I don't know if you want to get into that, but like it's interesting. So in the time of Hillel and Shammai, so was Hillel the head of the Sanhedrin or the Nasi? Do you know? I'm
Hillel
just
was the
putting
head
on.
of the was the Nasi. Hillel was
He
the
was the
Nasi, and
Nasi,
Shammai was
and so
the
Shammai was the head of the Sanhedrin. Okay, that's interesting. So but at the time of Hillel, you had Herod, who was the head of the community. No, right? I mean, he was the tetrarch of was not a tetrarch. Ethnarch. He
it
was the
looks
ethnarch of
it's looked
Israel.
yeah. So it's looked anachronistic. So it's
Okay,
not.
so in other words, the term Nasi
Well,
later had a function that it's not clear that it what it was or how it functioned in Second Temple times. Okay,
yeah.
so so let me ask you this, and I don't know if you want to comment on this. Totally off topic of what I thought we would talk about, but I had this conversation recently in a different podcast, and I've had this conversation outside the podcast. There's an approach within the academic world that if you want to, and a lot of times it comes from the perspective of well, historians want to understand the cultural context of Jesus, who is, let's call it roughly around the year 30 CE or AD, Christians say. Um, and so one approach is to say, well, what's our earliest literature? We've got the Dead Sea Scrolls, okay, but that's of a particular group. We have Josephus, we have Philo, but that's outside of Israel, so that's of limited value. But then the major source we have to understand the context of Jesus and the Gospels, perhaps from an academic perspective, more importantly, is the Mishnah and the Talmud and the related literature, all the literature of the Tanaim and Amoraim. That's one approach. A second approach says no, there was this thing called Judaism, and out of Judaism of the Second Temple period of the time of Jesus grew two completely different, unrelated movements: Christianity and Rabbinical Judaism. And Rabbinical Judaism can teach you no more about the time of Jesus, well, probably less about the time of Jesus, than if you study the Christianity of Constantine, for example. So that's an approach I encounter a lot, that second approach. What are your thoughts on that? In other words, when if here's how I put it in a different podcast. If Shammai or Hillel went into a Beit Midrash in Babylonia, and Rava and Abaye were there, and excuse me for my Ashkenazi pronunciation, um, would 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 Shammai and Hillel be more familiar with the third century Beit Midrash of the Amoraim or the church of or Origenus of Origin? And I don't know if we know the answer, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I never thought about think about it.
Okay.
So
So in other words, is there a continuity? And this is something I think you study. Is there a continuity into the Amoraic period of something that existed earlier in this Tanaitic period? Of course, I mean they're almost obviously right, but that predates 70. That's the question. To what extent is there a continuity, and to what extent is it the temple's destroyed? Let's make a completely different religion now, right? Well,
yeah. So I think the continuity is large. So
okay.
it's not a so they try to follow the all their theology is to follow the fathers, to follow the ancient generations. So Josephus called it. I remember that just the term in Hebrew, minagei avot.
What what is it?
Minagei avot.
The
So the
traditions of the
Purushim,
fathers.
the Torah, yeah,
The traditions of the fathers is
yeah,
minhagei
yeah.
avot. Yeah. So in other words, there's an ideology within rabbinical Judaism in the Amoraic period, which goes back to the
In
Tanaitic period,
Amorite period, in Tanaic period, and also
which
the
Josephus
Torah.
mentions that you should follow the traditions of the fathers. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
So of course there are change. There is now the Amorite period are not exactly that, not identical to the Tanaic period, and of course not to the Temple period. But they they think on themselves that as continuation of of the Tanaic and
Oh, that's
the
really important because I'll hear this all the time from some scholars that the rabbis in the Mishnah and the Talmud didn't think of themselves as Pharisees and thought the Pharisees had nothing to do with them. The Prushim. Is
Pharisees.
that
No, I don't think so. The rabbis in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, it's too far
okay?
but in the Tanaic literature, it's clear that they thought about themselves as Pharisees. So it's a
As a
continuation.
continuation of the Second Temple Pharisees, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Okay. I mean, I knew that, but I've been told by it doesn't matter. There's an
So
idea out there that
yeah,
the Pharisees were something that ended when the temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av in the year 79 CE, and then after that they said, "Oh no, Pharisees, that we have nothing to do with those guys." That's
I don't know if there are some opinion like you mentioned, but it can be a debate about if they are correct, they are the
ah,
continuation of the process. But what they thought about themselves is clear, I think.
okay. And look, you have figures. I don't, and here you could tell me historically, as someone who studied
Just
this in the
just can
universe.
just let me finish.
Please.
The
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go
Origenes,
ahead.
Origenes of the opposite don't think on itself as a continuation of the process. So and
Okay,
not
so Origen, guys, is an early third century Christian church father, and again, church father is a technical term, and it's Origin is spelled Origen, right? So in Hebrew we say Origenes or Origenes, which is the Greek form, and look, he's a very important figure for what I do because he compiled he studied the Septuagint, and we won't go into that. But the point is, you're saying if you asked Origin, is your belief a continuation of the Judaism of the time of Jesus, he would have said, no, of course not. That's the whole point that we're not. To what extent was it? And maybe that's beyond your scope of expertise, but in other words, you could say that Origen said that, but maybe it wasn't true, or to some degree it wasn't true. In other words, there could be things that are continuations from Second Temple Judaism. Um, that Origin didn't realize where he got them, and he's like, no, 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 this is an original thing that was established by the apostles, and actually, it's just something they lifted out of Second Temple Judaism. I think there are things like that. Um, but anyway, let's not go into that. All right, so this is an important background now because you made the statement. Now I think hopefully people can understand that in the Tana literature of the Tanaim, the Tanaitic literature. Correct me if this is. I think this is what you said. There is no reference to a Torah scroll that contains the entire Torah.
in Tanaic literature. Yeah, there are no
There
reference.
isn't. So it's only you have a scroll of Exodus and you have a scroll of Deuteronomy, but a scroll with the entire 5 books you're saying there's no explicit reference to?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
But
Doesn't mean it didn't
maybe there
exist.
was, yeah, it's not yeah. And
Right.
we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls there are one example of of fragments from two books
Oh,
from
so which one is that? Do you
Genesis.
remember what that is?
I don't remember
Okay, but
the
you're saying
third
it's
part.
Torah books. In other words, there was such a thing as a scroll in the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Second Temple, where they had at least 2 books together, if not the whole Torah.
Yeah,
Okay, look, and that seems to be alluded to by Josephus, where he says the Romans came and they took a copy this book of the law from the temple and they paraded it through Rome. Although maybe not. Maybe that was just the volume of Leviticus they took and they didn't know any different, right? So that's interesting. I never thought of that for what Josephus is saying. Um, so that's interesting. So in other words, today when we say a Torah scroll, it's always the 5 books of Moses. It's never
yeah.
just one. But even in Tannaitic periods, you could have just a scroll of Exodus. You could have just a scroll of Leviticus. That's very interesting. So the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll, at one point it was feasible to say, and by the way, give me a date on the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll.
Oh, okay. So the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll is in 1989. There was two carbon-14 tests made of the
Of the
one
scroll.
fragment.
Of one
Yeah,
fragment, okay, yeah,
the
and
Ashkar-Gilson fragment. So the
okay,
Ashkar-Gilson is just one fragment of all
okay.
this. And the date was about the 7th, 8th century.
So the 600s or the 700s, and you say about because C14 people will think, oh, C14 came back and it was from. You've seen this. I've seen this back in when I used to watch CSI and Law and Order, and they would have like a carbon 14 test of a body, and they'd say the person was died in the year 1943, which I mean is impossible now, right? It's too recent. Meaning carbon 14 doesn't actually work very well if something's too recent. Um, but if you go back far enough, so it's not an exact year, it's a range. So it could be the 600s or 700s. And how many other, and so when's the last Dead Sea Scroll?
So the last Dead Sea Scroll is Dead Sea. So I think the more accurate term is Judean Desert Scrolls, because the Dead Sea is just of next
Uh-huh.
to
So they're
the
popularly known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, but in Hebrew we call them Megillot Midbar Yehuda, the Judean Desert Scrolls. Okay. So
because
when's
not
the last Judean Desert
case.
Scroll?
Yeah.
I mean,
So
still the organization that publishes them is called the Dead Sea Scrolls Foundation. So, but okay.
yeah.
So when is the latest of the Judean Desert or Dead Sea Scrolls, so-called Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah, so it's in the end of the Bar Vault.
135. So 135 is the latest Judean Desert Scroll, meaning it wasn't necessarily written in 135, but it was put in the cave in 135, or it couldn't have been put
Yeah,
in the cave later than that. Let's put it that way.
yeah.
Okay, and then from 135, when's the next, other than the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll, which is the exception that we're talking about that you discovered 13 more fragments of, when is the next when is the next um, earliest dated biblical manuscript where the date is not disputed? Let's put it that way because that becomes important. Let's limit it to things that have been published and other. So because I
Okay,
know you
so
know about stuff that's not published that you're going to publish. Let's save that for a different when you publish it. Other than that, what is the earliest undisputed dated manuscript of the Bible, of biblical?
probably the Engedi scroll. So the Engedi scroll
Okay.
is a scroll that also from the Judean desert
Mm-hmm.
and Dead Sea. So Engedi
Mm-hmm.
is next to the Dead Sea,
Uh-huh.
and it's
I mean, it's a lump of carbon today, isn't it? I mean, it was
yeah, it's a
burned.
lump of carbon,
It
yeah.
was burned. Okay.
And with advanced technology, the researchers was able to read it. It's a scroll of Leviticus, exactly the parts that
So we've
missing.
got the Ein Gedi scroll from, and what century is that? Do you think?
We
Or
don't know exactly. I think that it's from the 5th century, probably.
okay,
Something.
but some people have said fourth century, fifth century. Okay,
And
so
also the 2nd century. So there
second
are
century,
also
maybe, which puts it not that later than the Bar Kokhba scrolls. Were there Jews left in Ein
maybe
Gedi in the second century after the Bar
yeah,
Kokhba revolt? There were. Okay,
yeah, yeah.
all right. So
The inscriptions and
okay, so what I'm actually trying to get at is of the medieval scrolls, what are the earliest ones? Let's skip the exceptions to the rule, which are the Ashkar, because this is why the exceptions are so important. The Ashkar scroll and the Engedi scroll and the other scrolls that you haven't published that one day you will, and so we won't say what those are right now. What are the earliest manuscripts that we have from the medieval period? Meaning we jump from 135 to give me
okay. So when we want to date a manuscript, it can be like in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We can know that they are before 135 because of the historical event,
yeah.
and there are internal evidence in a manuscript like a colophon. So like a
Okay.
colophon is a text mostly in the end of the manuscript that mentioned the name of the scribe and the date and the place and some
So,
other
guys, it's like a
information.
title page, but it's generally at the end because until the end, the scribe doesn't know when he finished.
Yeah.
Right? It might take him years.
Hmm.
So, all
And
right.
in the beginning of the print, in the 15th, 16th
Yeah.
century, the
Yeah.
printers, I don't know what in Latin printed
Mhm.
books, but in the Hebrew books,
Yeah.
we can see the all the information that now are in the beginning are also like in the manuscripts
Oh,
in
at
the
the
end.
end. Oh,
Yeah,
that's cool. All right. So they were continuing the manuscript tradition early on in printing. One of the really cool things I saw in Cambridge was it was a chumash, the Torah, and it was printed on parchment. Right. So it's an early printed book, and they said somebody must have said, "Hey, this is too important a book to print on paper. Let's print it on parchment." And
yeah.
it's very beautiful. So okay, all right. So we've got this. Oh, so you didn't tell me a year, did you, or a century? What
Okay.
when?
So
Yeah.
so the first one, the first colophon is from the date of the explicit. There are some dates that are not so clear, but the first one, the earliest one, is 956. I think I'm not.
Well, no, we have one
For
from
for my
903, 904 from Iran, right? So we have the
yeah,
fragment
this is
and
the Bible, but there are a
so what are
Mishnah
you referring to?
codex, a Mishnah
Oh,
codex.
oh, 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 you're talking about, so then it's 800, right? So you're talking about the one that Judith
Yeah,
Schwanger recently
eight
identified. It's from
850.
8 what, 56?
I think 856 or
It's the
8.
850s or something. Okay.
Yeah,
Um, so, all right. And then we have Bible fragments that are, and you're the expert in paleography. Mordechai, guys, is actually a paleographer. So there are Bible fragments that are from roughly around the same time. So they're also from the 800s,
yeah,
right? So in other words, we have this gap, guys, from the year 135 up until the 800s. And
yeah.
if we want to talk about where there's an actual date in the manuscript, and the date is not disputed, that's where things get complicated. So then we're at the year 903, 904, where there's fragments from the Cairo Geniza from Iran. There are earlier dates in manuscripts. One's from the year 847, but it's pretty much universally considered a forgery. And there's another one from the year 895 that's a little bit more disputed. But now the difference between 895 and 903 is not important, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's close enough, right, for this purpose. So in other words, we have stuff from, and we have things that Israel Yevin argued were from the early ninth century, right? So, okay, well, we could say 850 for sure. If he wants to say it's 825, sure, why not? So, but anyway, we have 135 to 850. That's a huge gap. And what is that called in your field?
Okay, it's called or two main terms: the Dark Age
The Dark
is
Age.
more, yeah, and the
What do they
Silent
call it in
Period,
Hebrew? Wait, what do they call it in Hebrew? The Dark Age.
תקופת החושך,
The period of darkness. Okay, the Dark Age. Yeah, okay. So there's either the Dark Age or what's the other one?
or the Silent Period.
The Silent Period. I've heard it called the Great Silent Period.
Oh, it's a great
So,
Silent Period.
right.
Just
So, in other
one.
words, you have something very surprising between 135 and let's call it roughly 8. We'll be generous. We'll call it 825. But if you wanted to say it was, 903, right? It's very right. That's disputable. But between 135 and 825, you don't have any Hebrew Bible manuscripts. In fact, you don't have almost any Jewish manuscripts whatsoever. And then we start to talk about the exceptions: the Engedi Scroll, the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll, the Afghani Siddur, prayer book, whatever it is, right? So, in other words, you could count on one or two. If you include what Mordechai knows that he hasn't published, you could count on two hands. Without what he knows that he hasn't published, you could count on one hand. How many manuscripts come from the Great Silent Period that we know for sure? Look, and part of the problem is some of these things haven't been carbon 14 tested, right? In other words, what's important about the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll, unlike the Engedi Scroll, correct me if I'm wrong, nobody's done C14 on the Engedi Scroll, is that right? Because it's probably not
No,
enough. It's
I
not
don't think
enough
that
to.
it's
It's
possible.
not.
Yeah,
There's not enough to test.
yeah,
But the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll has been C14 tested, and it came back to the 600s or 700s from the silent period or the period of darkness. And why is this so ironic to me? One of the greatest periods of Jewish literary production, let's put it that way, is this great silent period, this period of darkness. In other words, the Talmud, which I know if they read 2 pages every day, it takes them 7 years. So I'm going to say that's something like 20. Do you know how many pages are in the Talmud in the Vilna edition? I don't know. Is it
not
21,000
two
pages?
pages. One page a day.
No, it's
Two
one
pages.
folio. So it's two
One
pages
folio.
for
Yeah,
English.
yeah, 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 yeah.
So how many pages roughly are in the Babylonian Talmud?
Is 2,700.
No,
2,700.
no, 27,000, you mean?
2,700.
2,700
2,000.
pages? Oh, okay. I'm bad at math, see? Okay. So there's 2,700 folios in the Talmud?
Yeah.
Let me see what Google says. Yeah, 2,711 folios. Okay, so that's 5,422 pages. And those come from the Great Silent Period, from the period of darkness, from the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
So it's Dark Ages of manuscripts, not of literary production. And in
Yeah.
the Talmud, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah.
So in the Talmud they mention books, right? They
Mhm.
mention they have manuscripts. Where are
Yeah.
those manuscripts? Do you have any explanations of where those manuscripts are?
Okay. So that's it. So I
And,
want.
and let me stop you for a second here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we have from the Christian world, so this is almost comical. In the Christian world, an early manuscript will be, when we say an early manuscript of the New Testament, they'll be referring to, P66 and P75, which are from the 2nd century. Well, that's kind of disputed, but let's not get into that. But let's call them 2nd century CE. And then you have the larger, more well-preserved manuscripts, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, and then Codex Bezae, which is 5th century, right? So you have these thousands of pages preserved from the 4th century and the 5th century. And then by the time you get to like the 8th and 9th century, New Testament scholars are like, yeah, don't really care that much about that manuscript. It's kind of late. And yeah, it's still important because majuscule, but it's a late majuscule. And then you go to to Hebrew Tanakh studies, and our early manuscripts are from the 9th century, and our equivalent to Codex Vaticanus is the Aleppo Codex from the 10th century. So this is what's going on here. So do you have an answer?
So I think that there are some explanations, of course, and I think
what are the explanations? What are the primary explanations?
Okay, so one of the explanations is that there was not so many books in this period. So most of the literature was transmitted orally, like the Talmud and the Mishnah and all those books.
Okay.
All those books. And they was so until the first mention of a written book of the Mishnah is from the 8th century.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So the absence of books of the Tanaic and Amoraic literature is because they didn't write it. So
there weren't that many copies to begin with.
Yeah.
And is
from
this
the 8th century is the end of the silent period. So it's
right. It's very close. Well, it's still within the silent period. In other words, the Mishnah manuscript that we know today is from around the year 850. We just said, written in what's called the proto-square or pre-square or whatever.
They begin to, if it's correct, this explanation, they begin to write books in the 8th century, and they increased to write in the 9th century. So we
Mm,
have from the 9th century because of course not all the manuscript that was written available today
survived.
survived until yet.
Yeah. So that's very interesting. So in other words, and I'm just going to throw out a made up number. Let's say 1 in 1,000 manuscripts survive. And so if you have, I don't know how many are in the Greek New Testament up until, let's say, until the end of our silent period. In other words, meaning how many do you have up until the 8th century? Let's call it 500. I made up a number. But maybe they had to begin with 500,000. How many copies were there of rabbinical, of the literature that we're missing that we know was composed in that period, right? The 2,711 folios or 5,422 pages of the Talmud, at least in the most popular printing. Those pages didn't survive because, number one, they generally weren't written, and even when they were written, it was relatively rare.
Yeah,
Okay, so that's what. What
but
about the Tanakh, the
yeah.
Torah? For
So
sure,
this
every
explanation,
synagogue had a Torah scroll. No, I mean, is that do we think
yeah.
that or
So this explanation don't consider the Torah, so the Bible. The
okay?
Bible was written, of course, all the years, all the
Okay.
period.
So why don't we have Torah scrolls other than Ein Gedi and your Ashkar-Gilson scroll and a few others you haven't published? Where are all
Yeah,
the rest? Why is the silent period so silent?
yeah. So I think we need to differentiate between two kinds of preservation. So
Hmm.
there are books that are intentional preserved in libraries by private ends, but one there are a decision to preserve them.
Okay.
So and there are non-intentional preservation like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Kaiogeniza that
Hmm.
was forgotten in some caves or some buried in some places,
Hmm.
and we were lucky to because of the climate and because of the work of the archaeologists, and we find them again. So the non-intentional preservation books are just kind of lucky. We have we were lucky to find the Dead Sea Scrolls
Hmm.
from the 3rd century BCE to the 2nd century CE, and
Okay.
the Kaiogeniza from the 9th century onwards.
Hmm.
But we don't have the same lucky to find a Geniza, to find
So in other
a
words, and this is
cave.
something I learned when I did my undergrad in archaeology, is that what you find in archaeology to some extent is happenstance. In other
Yeah,
words, it's mikre. It's just it's and one of the things they taught us at Hebrew University in archaeology is you have to be very careful to say something didn't exist because you didn't find it. Because number one, in archaeology in particular, and you're digging in an ancient site, you never dig the entire site. Maybe the part of the site you did, and usually you at a very big excavation might do 5% of a site, right? Well, maybe it's in the other 95% and you just didn't find it. And then what you find is somewhat random. At least that's the scientific principle that's employed, right? That you have to assume what you're finding is random, and therefore what you didn't find may or may not have existed. Which is, I think, a principle in science in general, right? There's an ancient Jewish adage I cite all the time: "Lo matzino eno ra'aya." We didn't find isn't proof, or the argument from of I think they say in English the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? That's
uh,
the English version. So okay, so you're saying, well, I mean, we know there were manuscripts during this period, we just didn't find them. Um, well, why is it that we found the Christian manuscripts? And I would say we found the Quranic manuscripts, but I don't know enough about it. I'm not so sure that's actually true. In other words, I don't think you have Quranic manuscripts earlier than the Sana manuscript. And when that's from is, well, beyond the scope of this discussion. But meaning, okay, but they'd only start in the 7th century, so I mean, we're
Yeah.
not going to find much.
So
Yeah.
the question from when are the earliest complete complete or a complete Hebrew manuscript. So from where we have an intentional preservation of a Hebrew book.
Or relatively complete. In other words, if it's missing the first 50 pages, the
Yeah,
last 50
yeah.
pages, close enough, right? So this is important, guys. I want to summarize. So you have the Dead Sea Scrolls were not did not and here we should be, well, I don't want to get into it. Basically, the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't survive because somebody said we need to preserve these really important scrolls. They were stuck in a cave. In the case of Cave 4, certainly after they were already falling apart in ancient times. Right. In other words, Cave 4 was probably a Geniza in ancient times. Cave 1, you could argue, well, no, they hoped to come back after the Romans were defeated by a
Yeah, but
supernatural event.
it's not important what they
Okay.
what they thought about it. The question is how it come to us. So
Okay.
there was a very long period that the books was not
Were unknown.
preserved.
What's an
Because of,
example of something? Give us an example of something that was preserved intentionally and never really lost. It was just kept. What would that look like? Give me an example of that. Of a Hebrew book, Hebrew manuscript.
manuscript. So it can be a codex, mostly a codex, but also Torah scrolls. Um, and they are preserved mostly on public libraries.
Okay. What
So
would be an
Universitas,
example? Yeah.
EBR 66. It's a codex of Tanaic work, the
Is
Torah
that
Kohanim.
Sifrei or Sifri? I always confuse those two.
Sifra.
Sifra. Okay, there. Okay.
Sifra in Aramaic is the book, the book.
Right.
Sifra.
But it's a collection of midrash from the Tannaitic period. Okay.
Yeah,
So
and it's
yeah.
from the 9th century. So this is a complete book from the 9th century. There are no dates because in the matter of the paleographical test,
Mm-hmm.
we can date it to the 9th century. But the other manuscripts like the Aleppo Codex or the
That's a good
Leningrad
example.
Codex.
Yeah. So Aleppo Codex
codices,
is I don't know that we know where the Leningrad Codex was before it came into the Furkovich collection, but the Aleppo Codex we know. Right, the Aleppo Codex was kept in the synagogue in Aleppo,
yeah.
and when people came to see it, they were told no and turned away, and sometimes they bribed the one of the people who worked at the synagogue, and so we have 2 photographs, apparently based on bribes, of pieces that have lost, but now since been lost. But it was kept in a safe until the safe was attacked on November 29th, 1947. After the United Nations announced that there would be a state of Israel, or they would split the British Mandate of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, and the synagogue was attacked and ransacked. But it was kept in that synagogue, probably. I mean, I guess since the 13th century or so, right? Meaning, the theory is that the son of Maimonides,
14th century.
14th century. I thought it was the son of Maimonides who took it with him to Aleppo.
Yeah, not the son. He was 4th generation from Maimonides. So
Okay.
it was yeah.
Okay, so in other words, Maimonides must have had it in his possession, it seems, which
Yeah.
makes sense because he says he used it. It sounds like Maimonides borrowed it and never gave it back, and then one of his descendants took it with him to Aleppo. That seems to be the case to me, at least. Okay, so but there is an example where it was kept in a public, and we have actually an inscription, or we had an inscription that was copied in 1942, that says it was kept in the public, in a public institution in Jerusalem, and then later ends up as a publicly available manuscript in Cairo. But somebody is very intent, and then in Aleppo, and then now at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. So it's very intentionally in every generation being preserved because they say, hey, this is important. Meaning as early as the 1050s, we know that they said this has to be preserved. It's too important to let it fall apart. Okay. And then you have other ones, like you go to the Russian National Library and you have a manuscript that looks like it was gnawed on by a family of rats, And I mean, literally, there's one that looks like that. But it's a very important, relatively early for Jewish studies, early Masoretic manuscript. I think it's EVR2B59 or something like that. And um, and that presumably, had a bunch of damage from rats or water or something, and they stuck it in the Geniza in Cairo. And then somebody, Furkovich, came and said, "Hey, what books can I buy from you from the Geniza?" Right. So, but nobody intentionally kept it. On the opposite, they stuck it in this chamber in the synagogue for it to naturally deteriorate. So that's
Exactly.
interesting. Okay, so given that dichotomy, why don't we have more manuscripts that were intentionally preserved from the 5th century? Why don't we have, and here I'm going to bring a concrete example, right? Isn't there something where is it Rabbi Meir who mentions he has a Sefer Mugah, a proofread manuscript, or one of
Yeah,
these?
yeah.
So where is
It's
his Sefer Mugah? Where is that manuscript? It belonged
Sefer of
to,
Rabbi Meir.
so it's the book of Rabbi Meir. Where is it? Surely somebody said, "Hey, this belonged to Rabbi Meir. We should keep it, and we should
Yeah.
preserve it carefully." Where is it?
Okay, so when we look on the Christian manuscript, so
Mm-hmm.
Latin manuscript and Greek manuscript, and we try to understand why they were preserved,
Uh-huh.
the answer will be there was a interest of preserving them, and there was an ability to preserve them.
Mm.
There was institutions for preserve. So there was monasteries, and after that universities, and some of the kings of Europe was collecting some um, manuscripts, and
Mm-hmm.
so there was an interest of manuscripts, and there was a continuation of institutions along the history, along the 1,000 years or more.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But about the Jewish manuscript, there was a lot less ability to preserve for a long distance, for a long period.
Why was there less of an ability for Jews to preserve the manuscripts?
The Jewish communities was not able to preserve manuscripts for a long distance because of the persecutions and the exile of Jewish communities from their places, and there was some occasions of burning their books, Jewish books,
What?
Hebrew
Why
books.
did they burn the Jewish books, and who burned the Jewish books? I don't know that the
Of
audience
course,
is familiar with
yeah.
that.
Okay, so the Christian authorities was burned the books because they argued that in the Jewish books there are assaults on Jesus.
Okay, meaning the Talmud insulted Jesus, so they burned the Talmud.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, and they didn't always know what they were burning, and they just, they weren't necessarily discriminating, say, "Oh no, this is a Bible, let's not burn this one."
yeah, yeah.
Um, Unfortunately. Well, I mean,
So
in
so
both cases, unfortunately.
it's a lot more challenging to keep a book.
It's very interesting. I was talking to this young man who is a Christian but I would call him he wasn't an anti-Semite. This is a Christian who says, Jesus was a Jew, so I want to practice some form of Judaism that Jesus would have been familiar with. And he had this post on the internet where he's talking about the Talmud, and he's saying, but the Talmud is so horrible it should be burned. And I contacted him. I said, you don't know what you're saying. People burn the Talmud, and then they often burn the Jews along with the Talmud, or force them to convert. And so this was someone who was truly innocent in the sense of, and I don't mean necessarily that in a good way, right? Innocent in the sense of naive, and that he didn't know history. He didn't know that there were people who literally burned the Talmud and then burned the Jews who wrote those or preserved those volumes. And I said to him, look, if you disagree with something in the Talmud, argue with it. Don't burn it.
Yeah.
But how interesting. This isn't someone who's like a medieval anti-Semite. This is someone who's genuinely, in a sense, loves Israel and loves the Jewish people, but he encounters these things, or frankly, he encounters caricatures of these things that he read online. It's not necessarily what's actually in the Talmud, although we'll say that for a different discussion.
So I don't want to correct this argument. Sometimes they are correct what the Talmud say, but in every ancient literature we can find some texts that are against other
Hmm.
groups.
Go
We
ahead.
can find texts that are not we don't feel comfortable in modern time to read.
Hmm.
So that we know it. So we know we are not, our perspective on the world is different. Um,
So I
and
think the point here is your perspective on the world might be different, but then there's lots of people out there today who they do not have, who have a what's the word? If I want to be generous, I'll say have a traditional perspective on things, and if I want to be not generous and nice, I'll say a medieval perspective on things. In other words, there's people who read in the Quran that the Jews and the Christians are monkeys and pigs, or I don't know if that's in the Quran or the Hadith. I don't remember. I'm not an expert in that. And they say, no, this is true. Like Allah said it, like or the Prophet said it, and we should treat them like monkeys and pigs. Um, and there's other people who say, people are, that's a time when Muhammad was being attacked, and he was saying things in defense, and that's not a way to sustain a modern society, right? And that wasn't his intention. Now you're of course reading intentions and stuff, a text from over 1,000 years ago, right? But we do that all the time in one way or another, right? If you say yes, I should treat them as monkeys and pigs, you're also you're saying, oh, and he meant that to be applied today, right? So the point is, how do you deal with that today? If you have, and look, this is something I just read a horrible thing today that some Jew in 2015 burned a church, and he wrote on the side of the church a verse from the Tanakh where it says their idols should be surely cut off. And I read this, and I love the Tanakh, and I think, what a dummy, what a stupid and evil person in the 21st century to go and burn somebody else's church because, okay, yes, it says that. And even if you want to say a church is a place of idolatry, which we could debate, right? And Jews do debate. Um, so how do you implement that into your life? If you're implementing that into your life, this is my view. This is my personal views. If you're implementing that in a way that causes suffering and destruction, then you're doing something wrong. That's just my personal view. In other words, we have all kinds of things in ancient texts which, taken in a certain way, could sound horrific to a modern ear and maybe to an ancient ear as well. What do you do with that? So you're saying there might be things negative about Jesus in the Talmud?
yeah, of course, no. I want to
Yeah.
clarify.
Mhm.
Um, the find the hatred in the Talmud is possible. We can find some expressions
Okay.
that are not. We think. I can agree that it's hatred,
Hmm.
but the question is if someone choose and uh, and focus on those expressions in in Judaism literature in the Talmud,
Okay.
and ignore all this kind of text in other religion texts.
Mm.
And so this kind of texts are common in a lot of texts. And if someone focus just on this type, just on Judaism, he is anti-Semite.
Okay.
So the same can be. I can find some behavior of Jewish communities that I don't agree at all, and I think
Hmm.
they are it's evil.
Hmm.
But in any society, there are some groups, some people that are evil, that are that are not right, that are. But if you focus just on what it's going in the Judaism, you are an hypocrite. So this is my
So in
idea.
other words, to put this into like very recent terms, there were people protesting in the streets against Israel. And then when there were massacres in Yemen for years and in Syria for years, there wasn't, there were very, very few, certainly were no mass protests if anybody protested.
Yeah,
And then when
yeah,
Hamas, during a ceasefire, rounded up people in Gaza and shot them in the streets in public so people would see, there were no protests from the same people who were protesting against Israel. And therein lies the hypocrisy. Even if you have a valid point there, which I don't, I don't think they do, but the fact that you're focusing on only when Jews are involved, that shows something about those people who are focusing on it. Yeah, there's something to be said for that. I did a program with about a church father who writes something like a Passover Haggadah, and in his and he was actually what's called a quartodeciman, meaning he kept Easter on the day of Pesach, on the eve of Pesach, in Asia Minor in today's Turkey, and in his Passover Haggadah, right, this sort of Christian Passover Haggadah, he describes the Jews killing God and the Jews nailing the nails in with their own hands. Well, wait a minute, that's not what it says in the New Testament, right? It doesn't say that at all. It says the Romans did it, right? So the point is, here you have something in an ancient Christian text which is just horrific, right? Is just blatantly hateful and not even consistent with his own. It's so hateful it contradicts the New Testament, right? So should we condemn all Christians for that? No. I mean, there's good Christians and there's bad Christians. There's good Jews and bad Jews. There's good Jews who say bad things, and there's bad Jews who say good things, and that's like every group of people. And there
yes.
are wonderful, beautiful things in the Talmud, and there are things in the Talmud that turn my stomach. I'll just say it. So okay, but that's way off topic. All right, we'll edit here. There's been an amazing conversation. We'll continue the conversation in the second half, where you'll actually talk about the Ashkar-Gilson Scroll, the scroll that was written during the Great Silent Period. And what's so important about it is we can count on one or possibly two hands how many Tanakh manuscripts we have from the end of the Dead Sea Scrolls up until the 9th century, and you discovered 13 of the 15 fragments of one of these scrolls.
Yeah, yeah. To
All
be
right.
more correct, there are six fragments of Bible fragments in this silent period.
What do you mean 6 Bible? What do you mean?
We have just 6 Bible fragments.
No, but of the Ashkar-Gilson, you have. I know you published 15 fragments. Am I wrong?
Yeah. Until Ashkar-Gilson are in the end of the silent period.
So there's 5 others from the Great Silent Period. So in the next, so there's 6 others. So and does that include the Engedi Scroll?
No, it's the Engedi Scroll and 6 more.
So we have 8 Bible manuscripts from this period, and you how many of those did you discover?
I'm not sure. I don't feel comfortable to make some announcements like that. But okay. I will give more details.
So we'll talk in more details in the next part. Thank you.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.